Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by my good friend and comrade, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing very well, David. Good to be with you.
Well, we're thrilled to be doing this today. We are joined by the one and only Cale Brooks. You know Cale from his work at the Jacobin Show and in Damage Magazine, which is an incredible publication, much needed. Also, keep your eyes out for their new print issue coming out. But we want to talk to Cale about a piece that came out a couple months back titled "The Left Did a No Growth." We have it right here. Y'all should definitely read it.
Is that your pithy title, Cale? Is that your language? The left did a no growth?
Yeah, I fought for that title, and I kind of regret it now, but...
I love it, man. It's good. People seem to really enjoy it. We shared it in the Left Reckoning Discord the other day, and people were very happy with the title in particular. But what's most important is the argument in here. And folks know if you watch this program, we've covered degrowth a lot. And we've talked with people like Lee Phillips, Matt Huber. We've also done our own segments talking about some of the messaging and the politics of degrowth. And I think all that's really important, right? Particularly as the left's looking to rebuild. But I do think it's also just as critical to look at the actual economics behind degrowth. And Cale's piece, "The Left Did a No Growth," really dives into some of the fundamental problems with degrowth. So I was thinking maybe, Cale, to start us off, I know this is, there's a lot of different writers and they don't all agree on different things. But if you were to give somebody a kind of general take of what the degrowth economic argument is, would you be able to sort of summarize that for folks who might not be familiar?
For sure, yeah. And just before that, I also want to kind of set up the framing. You kind of already alluded to it, but this is like an ongoing debate that's going on in the left right now between degrowthers and some other category that is a little kind of heterogeneous, but generally pro-growth, that growth is not seen as the enemy in the same way that degrowthers see growth as the enemy. And so there's been a lot of degrowth critiques that have come out in the last year, 2 years, actually going back all the way to the first kind of, I think, pivotal one on the left is Lee Phillips' book from 2015, which actually obviously comes out before the Bernie moment. But a lot of his analysis, I think, is still relevant. And so in a lot of these critiques, the focus is on the politics of degrowth, that it's politically unsavory because much of it kind of sidelines workers. And the focus is on the climate at the expense of pretty much every other issue, that we have to deal with the climate. And the main problem facing the climate is runaway economic growth. And so the degrowth critiques so far have largely, although not exclusively, been focused on the political dimension of this, that it's just really... it's tough to get this off the ground. And so I wrote the piece thinking, well, look, maybe it's politically unsavory. It's not possible to get this off the ground and in kind of a mass movement type of way, in the way that like socialist politics would be understood and be recognizable to people on the left. At the same time, it might be the case that degrowthers are actually correct in their analysis, in their economic analysis. And then the problem isn't that degrowth is, wrong. The problem is that it's right and that it's actually really difficult to get it going. And so that actually, if it's correct, then the problem that socialists face is how do we make degrowth more acceptable or more popular among working class people and generally kind of the left audience. And so I think that's a real thing that the left has to, in order to not be dogmatic about this, to actually think through, like, well, what do we really have to do to deal with kind of these massive challenges facing the world and facing the working class, is to take this seriously. And I tried to take it as serious as I could take it, but I find the economic argument undergirding degrowth also to be pretty flimsy. And so I'll then get into what that means. But again, ultimately, I think the political critiques are important, and they're kind of buttressed by the fact that the economic critiques are also, I think, pretty damaging to degrowth. But the degrowth argument is basically the kind of the simplest version of what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe everything I just said is complete and just gobbledygook. But the degrowth argument effectively is that we face climate change, we face a warming planet, we also face a number of ecological catastrophes that have to do with pollution, and just a lot of it looks like, and in some ways, like this is a very compelling and obvious case that like there's too much stuff, there's too much waste that's going just out into the open, into the environment, to the oceans, that the temperature of the planet is rising. It's this growth of all these bad metrics, and it's true, those are all bad things. And it starts with that there's kind of this runaway of all these bad things, and that they just kind of keep growing exponentially, and that therefore we should stop the growth of those things to then deal with the climate catastrophe, to deal with climate change, deal with ecological problems broadly. The more kind of refined version of the degrowth argument that I think is the one you have to deal with is not that per se. I mean, that is kind of the general thrust. That is kind of the most kind of popular understanding. The degrowth argument really is that we are in the process of decarbonizing. In a lot of Western countries, we are. And especially, China, for instance, is undergoing a massive effort to decarbonize. The problem that they put it, as they put it, is that the decarbonization is not happening quick enough in order to stop the rising carbon emissions. So as there is more growth, growth means greater demand. That means the demand leads to greater throughput of energy. When you have more stuff, you need more energy to power that stuff. And so even though we are currently decarbonizing and we are switching to renewables and wind and hydroelectric, nuclear, things like that, even though that process might be happening at a pace that is not what we want it to be, but is actually happening, even if it got better, even if it did get to a better pace, the problem is that the actual, even though relatively we're using less carbon emitting energy sources, the absolute amount of carbon emitting energy sources would be increasing. We'd be using more coal, more oil, and that is what's contributing to the climate crisis. That's what is contributing to the rising temperature. And so any growth, even though we're decarbonizing, is going to lead to greater carbon emissions, and therefore the only way out of this in the degrowth argument is through reducing growth absolutely, is reducing the absolute throughput of growth in society. And part of that, again, this is sometimes couched in like selective degrowth, that it's we want absolute degrowth, but of specific industries. So let's degrow oil and gas. Let's degrow certain kind of production processes that emit a ton of carbon pollution, like cement. Let's find other kind of materials that go into production that are less carbon emitting, et cetera. That I think is still it still falls to the same kind of falls prey to the same problems as kind of the general degrowth explanation, but we can go into that more thoroughly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's the thing that's tough sometimes about critiquing degrowth is that like there are multiple figures. And I think that like the ones that you sort of focus on, particularly Hickel, is like, I think at least where you're going to get to more interesting places. I think some of the other folks, we've played clips of them. We've sort of broken down their arguments, and a lot of them, I don't know, can get a little bit silly and a little reactionary. But I think it's really important to note some of the substitutions that are going on here, even within this argument that the pro degrowthers are making, and you get into it in your piece, right? Because one thing I've just sort of noticed as somebody who, does this for a living, spends a decent amount of time online, is like you realize that there's different levels of understanding about these kind of subjects, right? So degrowth, there are like degrowthers, and then there's people who sort of see degrowth as an argument that like, oh, like we make too much plastic stuff. So like ideally what we need to be doing is like eradicating plastics or making less plastics, or that like, oh, GDP is a bad measurement of like human life and human value. So, we're basically saying F you to the capitalists and trying to do something different. But there's this substitution between like GDP and growth, right? And what they call like growthism. Could you help people understand the substitution that they're making in their arguments, Cale? Yeah.
So, again, like you're saying, GDP is the gross domestic product. It's the amount of new value that's created within a country, usually within a year. That's the kind of the measurement, year to year, how much new growth of new stuff, new value is produced. There's lots of issues with GDP and how it's measured, both from kind of like a Marxian perspective, like what are we measuring as new value? Also, from the just kind of humanitarian critique of, is this the way we want to measure how successful our society is? Is it in the new value added? Is that a better society than a society that has a lower value added? And there's whatever critiques you can have of that. And there's many left critiques that go back decades of GDP. But fundamentally, I think it's fair to say that it's not a measure of human worth, of human need, of are people, getting enough food? Are they living in decent housing? Are they getting a good education? Are they able to live lives that are worth living? Now, obviously, in order to live a good life, you're going to need a bunch of stuff. Every person is going to need a certain kind of material foundation. And so on the one hand, we do want to say that like there is growth that leads to, people's needs that can, translate into people having housing and healthcare, et cetera. And that's just growth for, that's just growth. Kind of in a neutral sense. And this is the way in which the socialist tradition has usually approached this question and said, we want a society of abundance where everyone has what they need. And so we need to actually get from here to there. And so there is a process of growing into that newer, more abundant society. Again, GDP is not like measuring that. It doesn't make distinctions between classes. It doesn't say where all the wealth is going to, where all the new value added is going to, if it's going to workers or to capitalists or someone else. The point is that, and part of this is also kind of the obsession of GDP comes out of kind of the post-World War II era, where you do have kind of the advent of macroeconomics, where you do have kind of a group of policy people that for the first time have a certain like toolkit to actually figure out how is the economy as a whole moving, looking at aggregate measurements. And this is kind of the Keynesian revolution, which turns into every other subsequent kind of macro evolution. And the point again is we can manage the economy. We can manage all these different variables, unemployment, new growth, inflation, all these things. We can find the optimal allocation of resources, of things in order to have, the whatever in their mind is like the best version of that society, the optimal society, et cetera. And so there is this kind of fetishization within mainstream economics, certainly, and then generally just kind of mainstream policymaking around growth is good because growth is higher GDP, and that's good. And it's this kind of growth for growth's sake that really, when you think about it, has to be growth coming out of profitability, that it's a society that is built around profits, and therefore you have growth as the result of capitalists effectively making profit. And so that's a very different kind of lineage of thought, but also practically it's a very different way of producing growth as opposed to growth for human need. And again, there's an open question about how do you actually have growth for human need? I think that's a different subject that actually is worth exploring. And that's a lot of kind of the efforts at social democracy and socialist ideas of what do we actually do to get to a better society. But principally, the first principle here is that it's in a socialist society, or kind of in moving towards something like that, it would be growth for human needs. What do people actually need? And there's a lot of people, and needs expand as you have a more developed society. So you would be growing for those needs versus growing for growth's sake, which really is actually growth for profitability. That it's you end up growing because there's a class of people who have a set of interests of making as much profit as possible. And through that war of all against all, trying to make that profit, you end up having this aggregate called GDP of new value added.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this substitution is really critical to get into, right? Because the substitution of growth for profit, right? I think, makes this theory really weak when you realize, for example, just how poor so much of the world is, right? So many people, this is from the World Bank, from its poverty and inequality data in 2021. But 85% of the world's population live on less than $30 a day, right? And you have to remember that, the reason why people are in the situation that they are is oftentimes where they are, right? Because if you don't have the infrastructure, the capabilities, to provide more for people, there's no amount of money that you can just sort of directly pump, right? You actually have to grow. You have to build the roads. You have to build the housing. You have to build the infrastructure for all these people. So, in the pursuit of, and like, that's just looking globally. You look at the United States of America, right? You want to deal with climate change. We're going to have to massively increase our infrastructure and invest in renewables and in nuclear, in public transit and all those kind of things. I mean, that's going to mean tremendous amount of social investment. And yes, growth. It might not be growth that is driven, and this is something that like we fight about, because like, if people like me and Huber and you and Phillips and all this were all sort of like big backers of like the IRA, right? Then you could maybe label us some of the kind of nasty terms that the degrowthers label us. But what we're saying is like, no, the social investment that we as socialists argue for is going to create these kind of things. And what we advocate for is breaking the stranglehold of profitability and the profit motive from these kind of investments so that we can build out green technologies and frankly, just better lives for everyday people.
Was it Lee Phillips who had the thought experiment that, if there was a sort of communist revolution in the 20th century, would we still have had the issue with climate change? And I think the answer we arrived at was like, we would have run up against climate change, but then we also would have responded to it better. Is that basically your feeling too, Cale?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in some ways, climate change is not an inevitability. Obviously, it comes out of the actual like kind of material usage of things like coal and oil and other carbon emitting both energy sources, but production processes that the actual development of the world. It happened through capitalism, but it was a development nonetheless. It was there's, I think, an important distinction between the actual kind of material development that occurred or could occur, whether it's in capitalism or socialism or some other third mystery thing, and then also the social relations that actually propelled that process forward in the first place. And so part of the novelty of capitalism historically as a unique and distinct economic system is the fact that it is driven to kind of constantly increase technology, and constantly increase productivity of labor and of the production process broadly. And because of the compulsions that are kind of inherent to the fiber of that system, basically competition, the fact that the kind of the major units are capitalists competing against one another. And so they're constantly trying to kind of revolutionize the forces of production, if you will, in order to have more productive and lower cost to them, lower cost production processes, lower cost at the unit level, so they can sell you all these things that are really cheap, and not just you, but to themselves. It's they end up having to produce all these things to sell them to someone on a market, and it's through that process that you had this tremendous explosion in growth. And if anything, I think the thing that people are more, this is something I say in the piece, that I think people are more kind of cognizant about is not so much like the numbers involved, although it's like obviously massively impressive, but the actual kind of qualitative transformation of life that's occurred in the last 200, 300 years. That life 300 years ago is massively different from now, but life 300 years ago compared to 600 years ago is not that different, relatively, when you compare these two. And so you have this massive transformation of society that comes about through capitalism, and you see it through the development of of production, of productive forces, of making labor cheaper and more productive, and massive investments and all this, these fixed investments of like massive machinery and massive buildings and production processes. And then, so Lee Phillips' point is that if you had a social rupture where it changed from capitalism to socialism or communism or something, you would still be developing. You would still have that process underway. And there's no reason why a socialist would a priori say, actually, oil and coal is bad. They would develop in the same way that capitalists would develop, but for human need. And so the actual kind of the distribution of what's produced would be radically different. The actual production process, how hard and how strenuous people are working, you would end up having higher productivity through the usage of machinery and technology, et cetera. But the actual kind of human toll would be far lower. In kind of again, we're not talking about the real history of communism, but if there was, if the theory and kind of the understanding of socialism came to be in the 20th century, you would have this change. And then Lee Phillips' point is that if that happened, and then if we became aware of climate change around the same time that we did, the only difference would be that socialists would respond differently to that new information, because that directly impinges on people's needs. It directly impinges on people's quality of life. And so we would transform our energy and our production processes to the benefit of people's needs in a way that obviously doesn't happen in capitalism. That the process of kind of relocating the material process and changing that would be radically different because of the different social structure.
Yeah, because, under like a social system in this kind of hypothetical, you wouldn't have to go up against like an entrenched oil industry that, for example, like wants to see returns on their investment, nor would you have to do, for example, what the Biden administration is doing right now, which is like pleading with private capital to invest in technologies and systems that the government wants them to, right? Radically different systems, which, again, like, I think, like, I'm glad you brought that up, Matt, because I think this really does get into like, some of the political economic like shortfalls of degrowth, right? Because, one of the things that they accuse people who are anti-degrowth of being Promethean, which, by the way, is like badass name, but like, people who believe are like technophiles, they believe.
Sorry, I'm too Promethean. Yeah.
But you make an interesting point here in your piece on this, Cale, right? Because you're talking about technical change, right? Where there's a lot of degrowthers who are very, very anti using new technologies, for example, to deal with climate change. We played Andrea Vetter, a clip of hers on this program in a debate she did with Matt Huber on nuclear power. So like there's this resistance there on technological change or fixes or, using new technologies. They're from the degrowthers. But you also take your aim at like these kind of, I don't know, would you call them green capitalists or like people who celebrate the system who oftentimes point to what's called green growth, right? Which you've seen in countries like the US, France, and other European countries in recent decades. I mean, could you talk about, I know I just threw a lot at you there, but like technology here, like both where like the degrowthers get it wrong and also like the over celebratory people writing the Financial Times get that technology promise wrong as well.
Right. Well, I guess this is kind of the crux of the critique, the economic critique of degrowth, right? Because on the one hand, the first thing is the critique of degrowthers. And then the second is why we're not, the same people as, what's celebrated in the Financial Times or something like that, or like whatever, general business press. And so on the one hand, the degrowth argument that I gave a moment ago, that the problem is that the decarbonization is not happening fast enough relative to absolute growth. That growth is keeping a pace, and therefore decarbonization is not keeping up. There's going to be more carbon emissions, regardless of if the decarbonization as it stands right now keeps going. Obviously, I think the kind of the major issue with this is that it assumes that decarbonization can't happen fast enough, that you can't decarbonize in such a way that you end up still growing, and yet carbon emissions are absolutely declining. There's within kind of the debates, one of these things, part of the problem is that it's something that it's a massive issue that faces everyone, and yet like a lot of the technicalities of what's going on requires certain specialized language because it's has to do with the specifics of technology and of certain production processes, but there's this distinction between relative decoupling and absolute decoupling, that the decoupling is decoupling the carbon emissions from growth. And so everyone, basically, the degrowthers included, agree that there has been some relative decoupling, meaning that as growth has continued to be positive in, generally, obviously the point about capitalism is that it's both secular and cyclical. There's generally growth is positive, but there's periods when there's a downturn, and that's what we call a recession or a depression. But generally, growth is still going up, and yet carbon emissions are in decline, especially in Western countries, kind of more advanced capitalist countries. Although globally, the carbon emissions are still increasing. This is the whole part of this. We haven't really touched on this. I know you guys have talked about this before, but this, the issue of decarbonizing the North versus decarbonizing the South, and big part of degrowth, or part of the critique of degrowth, is for some of them, they say, fuck it, we don't care about the living standards of people in the global South. They won't say it explicitly, but that's ultimately what comes out of their explanation. But kind of, again, their explanation of decarbonization not happening fast enough, it would be true. They are, like, the reason why it kind of makes sense is that we kind of are on pace for that right now, that that decarbonization is not keeping up with growth. That is true, except unless we actually change that process and we actually move from relative to absolute decoupling. And there's a sense in which that has already happened. And there's competing data on this. You can, again, part of this is, my study versus your study. And when you get into that war, it's difficult to come out of it convincing people. But and that's unfortunately a lot of what the debate turns into when you get into the nuances of it. But you can find studies that say we have been absolutely decoupling. To me, the most important part of that, to the extent that we have been, the actual decrease in carbon emissions largely has to do with the transition away from fossil fuels towards nuclear, beginning, really the production of it begins in the 70s, but really you can see it from the 80s onward. That has to do in part with the response to the oil shock. And it took, a good chunk of a decade to bring on a bunch of nuclear power plants online. But the point is that once that happens, you actually do have absolute declines in carbon emission, because it's the lowest carbon emitting energy out there, basically. Until we find something else, that's kind of the gold standard. Obviously, the problem with nuclear that we face is the cost. And so the problem with degrowth is not that this has to happen. This is kind of, they build in this kind of prophecy that we're stuck on this trajectory, and therefore the only possibility to get out of this mess is to just degrow, is to stop growth. But the thing is that if we actually were able to increase decarbonization, if we actually were able to transform our energy systems, then you wouldn't need to degrow. In fact, you would increase growth. You would grow by building all this new energy. You would transform the energy grid and the energy systems, the power plants, into one where you can still have massive growth. You can still respond to demand. You can meet people's needs, and yet you would have less carbon emissions. So part of this is just this kind of what I call a capitalist realism, where it's the imagination of what's possible is limited by just the way things are right now. That capitalism is what it is, and so we have to play by the rules. And it completely loses sight of, again, the entire radical tradition, but especially Marxism and socialism, which the whole point is to develop ways of changing the world so that it's in an anti-capitalist direction, so that we meet people's needs. That was why, that's the ethos that undergirded all of social democracy, and of course of socialism. And really, this is, again, turns into ultimately a political problem, which is, okay, so if you want to degrow certain industries, if you want to degrow oil and coal, good luck. Are you going to tell them, stop that, turn it off? You have to wage a massive war against them. And there's a question, it's not going to just be oil and gas, because those are companies. The actual capitalists that invest in those companies invest in a bunch of other companies. And so you're going to have to go to war with the capitalist class and profitability above human need that extends to every single sector of the economy. It is a structural fact about capitalism that it's about profitability in any one sector. And so if oil and gas is more profitable, there'll be more investment there. If shoes are more profitable, there's going to be more investment there. If taco trucks are more profitable, there's going to be new investment there. And it's the flows of new profitability. And you have to be able to go to war with the fundamentals of the system if you're going to say we're going to take out that sector, because it's not about the one sector. It's about taking on the capitalist class in its entirety effectively. And obviously you don't have to win against them all at once, in one single swoop. Again, just if you look at the history of social democracy, you'll see how anti-capitalist struggle proceeded kind of inch by inch here and there, and taking on certain fights. And often it was unions winning a particular contract, or it might have been, the results of that leading to certain legislation that transformed aspects of the economy. And to the extent that that's possible, again, it's predicated on the strength of the working class, of their collective power, the strength of some kind of left political party, whether it's a socialist party or Labor Party, or in the United States case, the influence of the left and, whether it's, the left and the trade union movement on the Democratic Party in the New Deal coalition. And it was these things, there was the channel, it was this channel of these forces leading to these outcomes that has to happen, regardless of, if it's some more relative decoupling, if it's some absolute decoupling, if it's a little bit lower growth, a little bit more growth, if it's, whatever it is, in order to actually take hold of these variables, if you will, of the actual carbon emissions and the growth rate, you have to take on profitability through the strength and the kind of uniting of working people into some collective formation. And that part of this whole thing, that we start to kind of move out of the economics into the politics, but that, of course, is completely absent from degrowth. And it's smuggled in at the last minute, and they say everything in degrowth is fine. This economic explanation is fine. The morals of this are fine. Again, I think there's some real issues with the morality of this idea of limiting how much people can have. And ultimately it says, and yeah, we support Bernie or whatever. If it's whatever it is, I don't care. Ultimately, as long as it reduces growth, the means justify the ends. And I think we have to be able to cogently link up the economic explanations, the politics of it, the actual political formation, and then the kind of the intricacies of struggle and of actual social transformation. Oh, but your question was the other side of this was the green growth side, which is sorry, that was my big, anti-degrowth explanation.
I mean, it was great. It's good.
The green growth side of it, I think, is very simple, which is just that insofar as there are different technologies that have to be put into place, that's not a secret. There's tons of people who know that and are working towards doing that. And so you can find Bill Gates talking about nuclear reactors. You can find all different people in the Financial Times talking about the importance of dealing with climate change through increasing renewables, et cetera. The difference is that they don't recognize that the way in which we got, for instance, nuclear energy in a number of countries in the 70s and 80s was not through a bunch of people realizing, oh, we have to do something about climate change. It came out of, some of it was that, obviously, but it came out, the thrust, the actual result, I would say, comes about because of the power of social democracy and of unions. I mean, again, the TVA in this country is a result of the left-wing thrust of the New Deal. And it's, in a way, I mean, it was at every step of the way, it was competing with capitalists, and it was going against the interests of business in that part of the country especially. But any kind of electrification by the state truly actually was, I mean, again, you can look at certain episodes or whatever, but the actual process was one at which business, the interests of business were made secondary to the interests of people's needs and of kind of rebuilding. So that's, if it's just a technological fix, there's nothing wrong with, changing the technology. That's important. That's a key aspect. The point is how do we go about changing technology? And that way there's this kind of technological determinism that occurs where the actual specifics of how you get from here to there, which is the most important question, are completely lost. And it just says, well, a better society would have better technology that deals with this problem.
Yeah.
That's skipping how we get from here to there. That is my main problem with the degrowthers, because it seems like with the banana thing, they basically say, well, we're just not going to do bananas. If you think you're going to need bananas, well, you don't understand these numbers. But also the previous, they say if you want bananas, it means you approve of the Guatemalan coup or whatever, right? And to me, it's all about the process. If there's a global situation where we're learning a political consciousness of this is unsustainable, people are standing up, as opposed to say, oh, we're a political party and we're going to say no more bananas if we get elected. Those are two very different things. Right.
I mean, to borrow from Fisher, it's not to focus on the banana thing, but I think the capitalist realism point that you make, Cale, is good, right? Because on that banana thing, right, just be a little flippant. It's very much fits in that famous Mark Fisher quote, right? It's it's easier to imagine the end to global food production than it is to imagine a socialist Ecuador, right? And that's the thing that has always infuriated me so much, especially when people start trying to talk about imperialism to justify these things. I'm an anti-imperialist through and through. I want to support socialist and workers' movements the globe over. I don't think that you get there with this kind of very pessimistic philosophy that I think is one bad politics, and as you're saying, is really rooted in some bad economics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, I totally agree. And to that point, I mean, what's wrong with a global economy? What's wrong with global production? The actual critique ends up being, carbon emissions, ends up being exploitation, ends up being the dominating kind of political features of these very labor intensive processes where it's it still has to be people picking fruit. And so in order to get human beings to stand out in the sun and do this, you're going to need to come down pretty hard with coercive, sometimes violent means to get them to do these things and sweat them as much as you can. That's a massive problem. That's what socialists have always said. That's been maybe the most kind of almost superficial socialist critique. That's the first thing you learn if you're a socialist, or if you have any human decency. You say this is a massive, horrible problem that people get pushed to the extremes, and it's profit over people's needs. The problem with a global economy or with global food production are those things. It's not the fact that it's growing. It's not the fact that actually, in some ways, you could make the case that having food production occur over different geographic parts of the country instead of everyone just locally growing their food in their backyard actually is less carbon intensive. For instance, it's actually a more equitable way to distribute things that people need. So these are those are where the actual questions are. That's not when you start with degrowth and then try to build in all these other things, it just doesn't kind of actually make any sense. You get an incoherent, kind of conflictory way of understanding the world and of doing politics, instead of starting with, well, what is it that matters to us? What are we trying to do, and how do we get there in accordance with our principles? And then finding the correct tools, the correct parties, the correct institutions, the correct amount of growth. That all comes out of starting with the principles of, making sure that people's needs are met.
Yeah. And, not to, the environmental impact thing, a lot of people, should this be influencing the way we approach things like resistance to new oil leases or pipelines? Because I think there's a lot of people who listen who can understand Bolivia extracting lithium is something like, because like that's something easier to support than say America, and partially because of exactly what we're talking about, like the nature of the state doing this, right? Like a climate denying petro state like America doing that is different than like a socialist state doing that. And should, like, how do you think like sensitive we should, or like how I guess active should we be in sort of like correcting that? Like, we're not against any sort of energy development, even though I do want to say, like, I think people are righteous for standing up to like pipelines and stuff now. But like, I'm curious how you think that should inform, because the pipeline stuff and the anti-oil, that's all the rage with like younger environmental activists now.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, I'm thinking more of the lithium example you gave, because you could pose the question of, look, we need the lithium to make batteries because we have to fight climate change, and it doesn't matter what happened in the process of getting that lithium. And in fact, if you're able to get that lithium as effectively and cheaply as possible, all the better. That you didn't, it's actually to the benefit of the vast majority, even though some people suffered in the process of getting that lithium. Obviously, I don't agree with that. But that is a real case that you would have to. That is like the argument that is made by the people who are in charge of our world and our economy. That you would that's the actual thing we have to deal with. That's not the we're not. It's not the Twitter debate. It's like the real fight out there. And and ultimately, I think on the one hand, things are going to happen the way they happen because we don't have any power to change it. But if we actually are trying to change the world and we are fighting against the way things are, I think you would, on the one hand, you would say we need lithium, but we need to massively transform how we extract lithium. There has to be a different process involved, and it's going to come at a far greater cost of production. And so we have to find a way of implementing a more costly production process, because we say that's actually what's necessary for to actually not destroy people's lives in the process. Now, again, costs are something real, and I think in some ways, like, I think socialists fall into a bad habit of pretending like there are no costs to anything, that we can just have the society we want by doing, we just change everything and we run up a huge bill. Like, it seems like, and there's a lot of versions of this. I mean, this is a different conversation, but for instance, like the left interest in things like MMT, where actually you can just spend money as much as you want and there's no limit. I hate to say it, but like, there are real limits, and like the ways in which those limits impose, consequences on you is massively important. This is the entire history of social democracies, figuring out what are the limits and how do we overcome them. So it is a real question of like, how do you actually change the production processes so that you do, for instance, on the one hand, if you're trying to build renewable energy, things like batteries, which we desperately need, or on the other hand, the question of like shutting down carbon polluting industries, shutting down pipelines or whatever, that what is the actual kind of cost of that? There's a social cost that comes out of how do you do the transition correctly? This is what Germany's going through right now, or other countries where the shutting down of clean energy like nuclear led to the expansion of carbon emitting energy, or so if you shut down, it's this trade-off that occurs. It's not obviously the exact same example, but the point about if you are going to shut down an energy source, what's replacing it? Can you actually put that back online? Or are you going to say, no, people have to suffer in the process through the transition? And again, it's going to be difficult to like actually, it feels like a juggling act, and it is in a sense, but kind of insofar as most of our decision making is saying we are going to build a world to the benefit of workers, and we're going to put more of the costs on the people who have benefited thus far, capitalists. And ultimately, there is going to be a cost that we all incur, but it has to be done equitually, like distributing the costs fairly, so that it doesn't fall on, the poor, it doesn't fall on any one group more than others. And I mean, this is part of what this is making me think about is like, there's been economic studies on social democracy, and the point was that actually the people who paid for social democracy weren't the rich. It wasn't that they taxed their way into social democracy. The workers paid for social democracy. But you can only do that through a more equitable redistribution of the actual surplus of what's generated, so that you actually do get the fruits of your labor through a more developed society. And you get far more benefits. So that would be the transformation that has to occur. It's who actually bears the cost, and in what way do those costs kind of manifest themselves? How do you incur costs over time, and on who? And so I think there's no doubt that the immediate first people who have to take the costs in some transition are going to be rich and powerful people. It's going to be capitalists. Because of just the massive amount of destruction that neoliberalism has wrought, and has kind of like completely stolen so much new wealth from working people over the last few decades. Then there's a question of, how do we keep transforming? How do you actually balance the economy in a way where you actually do distribute wealth equitably and continue to build with a different set of incentive structures involved that are not profit over people? These are obviously extremely difficult questions, and doing it at a global level is too much for a single person to even try to figure out. Obviously, none of this enters into the conversation when it's just, there's just a little too much growth going on, and we need to cut that. The problem is that we're eating bananas that come from a global economy. We're just so far from the actual real and difficult questions that the left has to figure out.
And the last thing I'll say, and I appreciate your time so much, Cale, but the last thing I'll say, and you sort of end your piece on this, and the thing that's really frustrating to me about the arguments, because I take them seriously, right? I really do. I always say that there's a spectrum of degrowthers whose work sometimes I find more interesting than others. But the thing that really gets me, and you sort of make this point in your piece, is that this argument that sort of starts with this grand critique of economy, right, and GDP and all this stuff, ends up replacing that critique by the end with just ideology, right? And that's how you can start to see that this is not really it's not as material as it needs to be, right? Despite it sort of claiming to be a material critique, it's growthism, right? There's too much growth ideology in the world. It's when you start making arguments like that, you lose me really quick, because we're talking about power, both politically and physically, in the sense of how we generate electricity. These are difficult and complicated questions, and I think that anyone who's giving it an idealist idea of this, the ideas of society are bad, versus the way that the society is set up to produce profit for the few, is the heart of this kind of problem that we're facing right now. This is I think what I find the most kind of insidious aspect of a lot of the degrowth writers is the way they actually kind of end their argument, so to speak. That if you pick up, for instance, Jason Hickel's book, he says a lot of the right things throughout that book. They're kind of peppered throughout there. There'll be, he'll say the problem is capitalism is for profit. And then he'll switch and say, and the problem is that there's just too much growth, that the whole system is about growth. You just keep growing. And then the whole thing about, it being for profit kind of gets lost, that, we got that buzzword in, great, but now we go into a different analysis. And once you get to the end, when you start to get to, well, what do we do about this? What are the solutions? How do you change this? More and more, again, I'm using him as an example. He's not the only one. In some ways, he's a more competent degrowther among kind of the crowd that's presenting popularly. But he'll say, actually the problem isn't growth even. The problem is growthism. It's the fact that people are focused on growth. It's the fact that people love growth, which again, you can find socialist critiques of this kind of growthism, of this fetishization of GDP for its own sake. The difference is that socialists say it's not really growth for its own sake. It presents that way, but it's growth for profit's sake, that it's profitability that's driving growth. Growth is kind of the aggregate phenomena of a bunch of actual individual capitalists trying to make as much profit as possible. So I mean, sorry. like last material point I'll make on this is just a way for maybe somebody who's sort of struggling to get at what we're getting at is like sometimes even the production itself is secondary to profit, right? So like remember what happened here in Texas, like when there was the oil crisis, right? And like the gasoline plummeted in value. They were having to pay people just to store gasoline, right? Because they couldn't find any place for it. And then a few years later, what did we experience? We experienced this massive oil price boom, right? Oil becomes incredibly expensive. And, you know, dropping the climate change stuff for a second, right? There's like a social need for gasoline in American society right now. Well, what did the oil companies do? Well, they didn't ramp up production. They were very happy to sit on their stockpiles and pull a premium back for it, right? So the fact that they produce oil or gasoline is like secondary to the profit. The production is secondary to the profit. The profit is the most important thing in that system, right? And like this is what we're trying to get at is like all the irrationality, right? From that example to like the irrationality of like choking and killing the planet through this kind of stuff is all secondary to profit. And if you drop that and start talking about all these other kind of things, you're really missing what the engine of the system is, and most importantly, who like the captains and the class and the people that we actually need to be confronting of the system is the change.
Yeah. And the, you know, the way in which this actually then proceeds through this, like the ideology of it, of, you know, the problem is growthism. In many ways, it totally obscures who the enemy is, because then it just says, well, if you have this idea, then you're part of the problem, basically. I mean, in some ways, it makes this the slippage that, you know, a lot of right-wing populists use to kind of have a base, that people like Tucker Carlson will come and bash the elites. And obviously the elites are bad. The elites are, you know, winning at your expense. But he makes the slippage between, he just says there's the elites, and that, you know, you end up losing that there's different kinds of elites, that there are capitalists, there are bosses who employ you, and then there are political elites who actually, you know, they make the rules, but they don't actually own the stuff. They make rules that say to capitalists, hey, can you please do XYZ? You know, we'll, in exchange for that, we'll cut your taxes, we'll do whatever. And capitalists who actually own the means of production can say, okay, great, thanks for helping me out, thanks for helping me make more money, or fuck you, I don't care, I'm not doing what you say, because I actually own the stuff. And the fact that, you know, the growthism is kind of this nebulous critique, which again really is probably more of a critique of politicians, because so much of this, it's kind of degrowth is kind of like the degrowth people, their economics are basically vaguely kind of within, you know, center left kind of Keynesian world, you know, the framework of Keynesianism, which part of that is part of the, you know, part of this distinction between like Marxists and Keynesians is the ways in which, you know, Keynesianism is developed as a way of figuring out policy. So it's largely a worldview from the policymakers. What can politician, whoever, do to, you know, to change the growth rate, to change the inflation rate? You know, here's how you move the things on the graph. This is like growthism is a critique of the policymakers who are so obsessed with just, you know, tinkering things in the economy in order to get the better growth rate. And obviously, like, that's, you know, there's a good critique there, but that's not our problem. The problem that is not like the main problem facing the world today, is that like politicians have, you know, the importance of growth on their mind. And the reason why they have that is because of the fact that growth is the signal. It's kind of how it's the signal, I guess, of profitability. That's actually the engine. It's, are capitalists making a profit or not? And the GDP is the rough estimate of, okay, it looks like profits are not too bad right now. Capitalists are happy. Capitalism proceeds, and the politicians have done their job to keep capitalism going. But again, this kind of, we're not even focused on that anymore. If it's, you know, it's growthism. And these people, like, at one point Hickel says, he says at one point in his book, it becomes clear that growthism is a little more than ideology. And another point he says how, like, this is how he ends his book, that the real problem is like that, you know, for the past 500 years, the dominant culture of our planet, the culture of capitalism, has been rooted in this rift, this kind of, he calls this like ontological rift that's occurred. and that the struggle before us is over our very theory of being. It requires decolonizing not only our lands and forests and people, but decolonizing our minds. And so if everyone actually just had better ideas in their head, then maybe they would come together and fight for a more democratic, more egalitarian society. Maybe, the politicians would realize that they're fetishizing something that's not as important as the planet. And all of this is just not how politics actually works in the world. This is just like, if changing the world was as easy as changing your mind, then why do we live in the world that we live in? Like, it's so obvious that, like, politics is about actually changing the balance of power over resources, and of actually effectively using resources and mobilizing people and their time to actually get a different outcome. That it has to do with the material world. It's not about, did you come up with the right idea? Do you have a better understanding of the world? Again, we're just the degrowth stuff, by the end of their own arguments, are so off track from where we need to be. And it maybe makes you feel good if this is your first time coming to this and you go, oh, actually, the problem's not so bad, actually, because if I just change my mind, and I change my friend's mind by telling him to buy this book that Jason Hickel wrote, and he tells some other person to buy the Jason Hickel book, then we're all changing our minds, and we're all going to, if it's just by ones and twos, comrade, we're going to make it there. And that's not again, good luck.
If only I wish, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up MMT, because it seems to me like those are two similar debates where
right now, Matt.
where you interact. Sorry, I'll make this quick, but where we have debates with people in this broad coalition of the left, but where in the MMT, I think there may be a bit more progressive liberal side of things, and then the degrowth seems almost like a flip side, almost like liberal, but also a little bit maybe anarchisty type of thing. But they're both trying to convince Marxists that we agree with them. Really. I don't know. It's just interesting. But the one thing I will say is that at least MMT isn't politically toxic in short term. So, it has that going for it.
Yeah. But, well, it's just one of those things. It's mostly academic. It's probably not really going to get off the ground. Degrowth is the actual academic side of it probably also won't get off the ground. The problem is the ways in which it kind of suffocates actual environmental groups, groups that could be more effective in doing something. Not that some NGO, some left green NGO is the solution on its own, but it has a place to play in fighting for a better world and fighting for social democracy. There's real pragmatic things that need to happen right now, and you could mobilize these resources and these people towards a better aim. And the problem is that the left in these organized spaces ends up getting kind of barraged with these just totally stupid ideas. It's just these things that don't actually add up, that actually make it so much harder to organize around the things that are crucial and really hard to do. And so again, part of this is, this piece was written for the left primarily, but it has to do with, let's get the left in the best fighting form we can right now, and kind of get our understanding of the world straight, so that when we actually are in positions to mobilize resources and to move people to do things and to fight for specific struggles and against certain individuals or groups or politicians or whatever, corporations, or aligning with unions in union drives, in contract campaigns, that we're not coming into this with a set of crazy ideas that are not actually at all relevant to winning any of these things, that are actually an albatross we hang around our neck consciously that undermines our efforts.
Well, Cale, it's always such a pleasure and enlightening time speaking with you. Appreciate so much, folks. If you haven't read the piece, there's links below, but you can find it if you're listening later. The Left Did a No Growth in the excellent Damage magazine. And again, Cale, thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. And just have to shout out, as you did at the beginning, Damage has a print magazine coming out soon called Building Big Things. We're not, a lot of our titles are not as eloquent as some of the other publications out there. We want, stop doing a no growth, build big things again, make stuff. But I hope if the politics resonate with you, it's worth checking out and supporting.
Yeah, I will just say, I mean, like Damage Magazine, for people who aren't reading it, across the board has been something that has been much needed on the left. Excellent pieces from recent guests of the show, like Matt Huber, Ben Fong, Fred Stafford's written for them. Dustin Guastella had an excellent piece a little while ago in it. It's definitely something to be reading if you aren't already. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thank you.